Hello everyone, today we talk about the organization of the medieval university studies. Yes, yet another bit about universities. We'll probably be dispensed from them for quite a while, so let's just observe this. It as we've seen in the multiple videos I made on medieval universities, you can all find in the relative playlist. Medieval universities began fundamentally at the end of the 11th century with the Bolognese studium that was not just, in fact, the oldest, but also the one that would become, at least as far as properly the broader center. Yeah, it's fair to say is the most important university in general, right? For size, internal. In fact, organization, development, the fact that it was provided with this just constitution from quite early age, reinforced by the Holy Roman Emperor, and that would remain, in fact, the single most important center of legal studies in Europe, to the point of fundamentally recovering not just Roman law and reorganizing it and commenting on it and spreading these works to the point of making them arrive as the standard doctrinal body, right, of juridical theory in the late Middle Ages. So I did make, I think, videos specifically about the Bolognese studium as far as its history, also in fact, from Irenaeus, the commentarists, and other great names that fundamentally in late medieval times kind of sclerotized the doctrinal body. Today we take it as an example for the sake of looking at, in fact, university programs, right, from quite an early age to the level of development that such classes had reached, right? So, a privileged position to look at how essentially a European university worked like at its most, right? And in this sense, we can start from the very beginning, because as we have explained, universities weren't born just like straight away as fully developed, essentially guilds, right? Because that's the face they began to take as institutions, etc. They developed spontaneously, and this is especially the case of the at least of the Bolognese model that was to take over, and developing gradually enough to provide us with some of the most interesting information regarding how, in fact, universities overall and throughout this path were built, how the programs were structured, how things changed naturally over time too, right? So again, the easiest perspective. So since the first time, the teaching of Irenaeus that had began fundamentally the recovery of Roman law with the Libri Legalis, and had thus opened a path there, was, as you know, crucial in the history of European juridical studies, and that would have very deep implications even in the institutional history of the Holy Roman Empire, etc. And so also by the way, the teaching of his direct pupils, because Irenaeus is also, he did exist, we just don't know exactly where he came from. Whatever, he was probably Italian, and specifically he gravitated around this important orbit that of jurists, of mostly of episcopal schools that had boosted naturally the juridical production during the investiture controversy. This is not much of an important, but this is just to say how spontaneously the university had been born, because essentially people needed legal knowledge, expertise, capacities, also for this tumultuous growth of contracts, of trade, of monetary economy, that at this point, especially in communal Italy, was booming, right, to the point of making money essentially on their own, right? So teaching law outside of the cathedral chapters, outside of, say, a career that was not necessarily ecclesiastical, because this was already the deal, right? These were laymen that already worked, but they worked for the bishop in that case, and also to gain that administrative expertise, and thus forming a nucleus of teaching on its own. This is how the university is practically born, because, and this was the point, they realized that lots of people, young people, needed that legal knowledge, would pay to be educated in it. This naturally is a self-evident sign of the spread need of juridical culture that naturally was coming on top already of quite of an important development. Most of what the university in this sense embodied was the availability by some scholars, some lawyers, of properly a structural doctrinal body, right? And knowing how to comment and interpret and analyze and to research further, especially Roman law, right? And thus something that was increasingly needed to fill the gaps of, however, the already imposing juridical theory and that existed at the time, because all these scholars were revival law began from essentially Longobardistic. At this point, Italy had definitely the most developed corpus of juridical, in fact, of juridical tradition. They had basically the Lombard law had been essentially the law, the ethnic law of the country, that was accompanied with some Gothic stuff that had been produced in the same Italy at the time of Theodoric, something perhaps coming also from Visigothic Spain or Burgundy, but from the late antiquity, but mostly from that base. Then the Carolingian Capitularia, then the feudal law that had developed in the meanwhile, then the other imperial legislation from the time of the Ottonians, the Salians, at this point, and thus already I made a video about this. Perhaps I should re-upload it because it was one of the old ones. However, it's out there, that studies exactly this. The Germanic law in Italy, from the Goths, the Longobards, the Franks, etc., and that had triggered this dramatic development of further studies on it. Again, because the complexity of the local society was essentially just taking off, and these pretty large amount of laws, even though they were actually effective and still actually functioning, right, but was becoming altogether unsatisfactory by the volumes, again, of trade, of money, etc. And Roman law was seen as not something that had to substitute all this pre-existing law, but something that had to integrate it, and that already provided you with the institutions, with the structure, with properly a doctrinal body that was naturally very complex, dating back to, in fact, Roman juridical culture, which, in fact, was more unitary, more internally coherent, and less kind of dispersed than the sum of all these other Germanic laws that at most were just, essentially a list of laws, fundamentally, and that's how they worked. So we're talking about a lay background, a literate background, and also a substantially well-off background, because these people had already some, in order to be literate, were already, capable of spending, of investing in that, and in having the money, in fact, to pay for this masters for further education, and evidently made jobs that were already essentially juridical in nature. So all from this background from the communes, of the development of centralization of the city, and the connection with the countryside, international trade. This is the age of the Crusades and further. So, in a first phase, how was the university born exactly? Well, in the first phase, you had this young people taking contact with a master, right? And they committed themselves in paying him an annual honorary known as collecta, that is to say the various collectum, so the sum of money was put in common by everyone, in fact known as collecta pro sapientia or pro doctrina, that is to say this collection for wisdom, for doctrine, right? In exchange of, in fact, the same lessons. Further amount of money had to be paid eventually for logistics, say the use of the rooms where these lessons took place. So this would be the collecta pro pensione or pro bunches, right? So for properly the locals and the tables where people had to just sit and listen. There was the money paying for the janitors that had to clean these rooms. This were known as collecta pro bedello, interestingly enough. So you immediately understand it was also kind of a infrastructural reality. Again, this is the world of the cities, of some spaces that could already be carved out of this kind of thickly packed urban communities, and that evidently these people had the money for regularly. We see here already a yearly timeline, right, to pay to maintain. And at this point, the master substantially put at the disposal of the students, right, his manuscripts of the Justinian texts, because that's what we call Roman law in practice, right? This was essentially the Theodosian Code as you know, reformulated. Made multiple videos about the Corpus Juris Civilis under Justinian that had remained with this idea of perpetua sanctio, basically putting together all what, at least the most important Roman juridical tradition. Roman law would had emerged historically just as common law, right? Eventually just the Byzantines made of it this kind of crystallized system that was, however, quite advanced for integrating really the most refined juridical tradition of a huge empire. And the reason why the literal manuscripts of the Justinian Code was necessary, because at the time there weren't so many copies circulating at all. I made videos again about this, about how much the Justinian Code had circulated also in Italy, where this had been also issued back in the 6th century, but that from in the following ones had surely kept circulating. It's just we can't track it in a manuscript form. We know it was around there, but for this point, for the Italians to need to essentially go pick the original manuscripts, at least the complete ones from the East. So the same Byzantine Empire that in the meanwhile had also had its own juridical history, and not it's a complicated thing. We will have to talk about Byzantine juridical history, but to make the long story short, there wasn't such like the original wall available just in use. So there had to be this massive philological research. Again, this is the reason why also it happens in these places. As you know, the Venetians, the Pisans, etc., were in the Levant, were in the Byzantine, in Constantinople, etc. So they had access to those resources earlier, and for more urgent reasons than other Europeans. So at this point, you see that the thing is quite archaic, right? We say that the University of Bologna was founded sometime, I think, in 1188. Right, it's not that we have the actual proof of that, historically speaking. We just know that at the beginning of the 12th century it was already a big institution. So we think that a date like 1188, as legendary or not, is is plausible. Right, it could have been 10 years before, 10 years later. It doesn't matter. What matters is that this community had formed and was already working and paying and kind of accumulating also its own resources further to systematize knowledge, to essentially preserve it, to collect it, to copy it, right? We've seen just the other day how much it costs just to have a manuscript. At this point, there wasn't paper around yet. It costs really a lot. In any case, that tells you also how important law really was to have this great circulation, essentially starting at this point. And at this point, the university, in fact, had to provide itself properly with an organization of copyists that had not yet formed. Somebody had to be paid as well. Also, this early times so a lack of actually mandatory lessons, right? This was done mostly for caching. In practice, there was not even properly there a fixed length of the classes, of the courses, and there wasn't even an exam at the end of the teaching, right? So the situation went on like this for a couple of generations, let's say, after which we are in the mid-12th century. The students began to organize themselves in some further groups known as consortia, which in Latin means essentially people who are bound by the same source, the same fate by a degree. So just like university, it means, directed towards a single aim. They were sort of guilds, right? Again, the thing worked pretty much in the same way. Every medieval community was known as universitas. Just now we preserved linguistically the thing that university is the only university we know. But anything else really was. Any military bands, it had the meaning. Also because it was all kind of transcendentally meant, right? Behind this juridical knowledge that surely discounted a bit already a pretty kind of modern secular mindset compared to most of Europe at this point, but it was still the idea that there was a broader duty for towards justice, towards order, towards the scientificity of the juridical wisdom, in fact. And the consortia fundamentally revolved around the same master, right? You had a master that had this following of students that organized themselves according to certain rules as a community. So and that was known as comitiva, in fact. That is to say, a community of work and of life that fundamentally operated within the school, but also outside of it, in the city, right? This is important again because those who paid for this education were also anxious of practicing the craft, right, of lawyers and so on. So in many ways, just the other day I made a video about how the medieval student would travel, what motivations was behind them. When you entered this consortia, you were part of a sort of family, sort of clan, sort of broader, something more than just a group, right? In fact, according to the sources, the masters and the students were not just soci, so allies, so with us in a society, in a company, but in fact contubernales. It's as if this is what Otto, the famous jurist, calls them. That is to say, those who lived in the contubernium, that is basically the barracks, right, in the Roman military language, right? So the idea is that these people shared a lot, just as a broader lifestyle, knowledge, vision, right? And this tells you how, again, powerful the inspiration behind all of this really was. So as we've seen in other videos, the students and masters of Bologna received in 1155 an important privilege from the Emperor Frederick I, who, with the Constitution Abita, posed them under imperial protection. Right, we have seen why Frederick was so interested in this, because the Bolognese studium was practically recovering Roman law, including Caesaropapism. So the idea, like in Constantinople, that the emperor could do whatever he wanted with practically with the investiture of any ecclesiastical office. So in a moment in which, given that the wars against the Lombard League, sponsored by the papacy, and the German expedition in northern Italy were concerned, was made a lot of sense, right? Especially for Bologna. And this was also a move to try to break sometimes the same commune, because giving rights, at least in this case to a university, equated also to have within the commune another, in fact, another guild, another polity, because this was what community really was. The universitary community really was within the commune, and thus, in this case, siding towards the emperor. Right? Consider that Bologna was also a bit of a contended city, because the papacy claimed its own control on there from the papal states, and the emperors thought otherwise. In any case, what did these privileges to the Bolognese student consisted? Well, the students received a privileged forum, that is to say, the free choice to pose themselves under, alternatively, under either the jurisdiction of the bishop or the one of their own master, quote, coram domino. This is crucial because it shows again how powerful the university had become, to even oppose such a powerful political figure like the bishop within the same city that historically in the Italic kingdom had, also by imperial rule, had such a great strength, but that now was being fundamentally hijacked by the communes, right? So very often the episcopal authority was the one that communes used as a proxy, right, to de facto expand also in the city district territorially and more. So having essentially the right, the imperial given right to be independent juridically from the facto the most important authority in the city where the university had been born, was of enormous relevance, right? It had great consequences, and the masters as such were also considered very highly. Later, aside from this, let's say, struggle between the emperor and the papacy, as you know, the doctors in law would be at the same level of knights, right? They had literally knighthood, and their status was publicly recognized as such, and that's because that's how powerful, not just juridically intelligent or consequently also rich professionally, but politically impacting, right? Because they could literally make law where, in fact, there hadn't been in this world like a kind of a universal law, aside from the one that was being developed, at least in the say lay field, like these very masters were doing at this time. That's why it was so important. Also, Frederick Barbarossa, through Abita, ordered the insertion of the same constitution within the fourth book of the Justinian Code, thus continuing essentially on the footsteps of the Roman emperors, and saying, as a Roman emperor, I also have the faculty of integrating this new law, right, as was done by emperors, but it could simply make these additions within the same code of Justinian. This tells you also properly how importantly ideological these moves were, right? In a world torn apart by political strife of the kind we know going on at this point. It was again a concession of enormous relevance that would anyhow be opposed by the Bolognese commune, that was seen limited, essentially, its own jurisdiction, and that naturally favored the birth of, let's say, associative forms differing from the originary ones of the university, right? And this was yet another move, because this initial experiment of the studium, etc., was yet to be generalized by this point. And there was a sort of diaspora, as we will see now, sort of break of conflictuality, of secession, that brought literally to the creation of different universities at the end. We'll see it better, but within the same university, there would be different groups that could do different things, right? For example, around the 80s of the 12th century, the university had grown so big that there were literally inhabiting problems, issues with the civil and penal, definition, what was going on with this community in the city and so on. The scarcity of money that was felt, especially by the foreign students, right, that thus began to distinguish themselves corporatively from the local ones. And around the same period, also the incarnation, meaningful enough, between the solidarity relations between the masters and the students, right? Because the masters were becoming de facto ever more detached, ever more elite, and the students were also not all to become masters simply as that. So it was a much less kind of, a much looser bond now within the same community. It had enlarged dramatically. It was ever more difficult to regulate. Among the students, in particular, still the foreign ones found themselves to sustain, aside from as we've seen, the burden of the collecto of the masters, also the expenses for food, for lodging, for the necessities of the school in general, and because there was also a great problem finding the exact copies of the books, having the time properly following the lessons, given that there were at this point ever more defined texts that could not also simply circulate around, had to be treasured by the masters, unlike before. And there was essentially now a demand for the reduction of the collecta, and also a greater didactic commitment, because some rules, naturally, everything was negotiated. The masters weren't there just to lose their time, but it's obvious that they would try also to be less committed at some point, to keep doing money and still following their business, their legal practice, etc. in the meanwhile. So this situation brought to two different consequences. From one side, you had, as you've seen, a fracture between the foreigners and the locals, because the foreigners began to search new groups, new associations, spontaneously binding themselves with students coming from the same region, right, same geographical area. From the other, the contrast between the masters and the students that broke the previously mentioned compactness of the comitiva, and the affirmation thus of this new aggregational form that was the natio. That is to say, again, this students group, creating a group on the base of their country of origin, that excluded the masters at the same time, right? And so essentially the Bolognese students now were something on their own, and there were new groups such as the Spanish the Germans, the French, the Catalans, the Provençals, the Normans, the English, that all gave birth to their own nationes. This was the name given to the nation, fundamentally, meant in a Latin sense, wherever they came from. The further step happened, was taken at the very end of the 12th century, because the naciones joined in the broader organizational form that is properly the one that we know as university, universitas. That is to say, something separated from the institution as far as the masters had fundamentally controlled it up to that point, and the entirety of the students. However, the universitas was not exactly the say the entirety of the students per se, right? But just the universitas that wanted to enter, say, in a relation with the institution. In fact, in Bologna there were two universitates formed. The one of the Citra-Montani, so the students coming from the regions located south of the Alps, and the Ultramontani, the students coming from north of the Alps. And every universitas elected among the students a rector who represented her in relation not just with the masters, but also with the commune, meaningfully enough. Why? Because, as we've seen, the studium itself had quite some problem with the commune, politically speaking, because I made a video, at least the one on the violence and pastime of medieval university students, that tells you at least the mess that sometimes these communities of students could make in the city, in other places, also seceding, being kicked out, things like that, and sometimes going to found new universities somewhere else. Again, because they were the ones paying. Consider this. In the video I made a couple of days ago, I was stressing this aspect, that this university education cost really a lot, right? It wasn't just okay, I will pay for this. Very often the families spent everything they had. It was a huge bet, right, on the students that were also to leave fundamentally their household forever in some cases, and or however they had at that point were depending on this money for, of course, achieving that goal of having a full career, a remunerative one, in the same with the wisdom that the doctrine they would have learned at university. So it was actually there were really lots of tensions, both social, political, etc. And the commune had also to mediate between the university, the students, and also overall, because again, there could be conflicts between the masters and the commune, that the students were essentially becoming the tip of the balance in the process of solving that, etc. And in the years between the 12th and the 13th century, the number of students that in Bologna attended the classes of the masters seem to have reached 1,000, which is a lot for the time. I mean, for cities that were at the largest, Bologna was a sizable city, but not more than a few tens of thousands of the inhabitants in the city, right? So actually a consistent amount. You understand also why the commune was fundamentally interested. Aside from everything else at this point, the wars with Barbarossa were over. There was a completely different situation. But I mean, all the students coming in the city were spending money, paying paying food to live, prostitutes, etc. So it was they were an important source of income for the local government, and it was also a bit, say, can't speak of scam, but given the difficulties that these students had even just in maintaining themselves, there was a lot of gambling, there was a lot of money circulating, and generally speaking, this flowed also in the hands of the locals in many ways. To this 1,000, you have also to add the other students that lived in the city without, however, attending the classes with regularity. These were known as the vagi scolares, plus the servants and the secretaries of the students. Again, the students were not by far poor people, average people. They were affluent people, at least, right? And they had their own aides there, and so these were all people that, again, had to maintain themselves and were to be, maintained locally, right? So there's a considerable mass of people that needed, as we've seen, the rooms for the classes, the places where to stay in the city, the stables for the horses, the supplies that all was necessary, even just to have a status there, right? It was not enough just to pay for following or attending the lessons. There was also a sense of, you had to show off, right, while you were there, because people at the time cared a lot about honor, about social status, all these things. So there were also, violent people, as we will see now. So they acted often without also recognizing some authorities, including, of course, especially the authorities were outside, let's put it in this way, their own spontaneous organization. In other words, the students acted as sort of a mob on their own against the authority, whatever. Again, it was not really in the sense of they were lefties or whatever. They had their own ideas. These were interesting kind of groups, even just intellectually speaking. But there was a sense that their university was the most important thing that existed. Thus, any other authority came second, fundamentally, aside from at least anybody who would bother. So the sense of, again, the youth usually is extremistic and somehow fanatic and emotional and all this stuff. So they embodied that. Sometimes making mass killing people, setting fire, brawls, things like that weren't like a terrorist organization. They were surely people who lived a normal life, a peaceful one at least. In any case, their presence posed some problems, definitely, to the communal authorities as well. Starting from probably the problems of public unrest, right? Such authorities began, thus, to crack the organizational autonomy of the students. That was the easiest way. For example, forbidding to the Bolognese ones to swear an oath of obedience to the universitates and to their rectores, and by affirming their jurisdiction on all the students. Right? This was particularly important. The distinction here is, of course, that the Bolognese students were also Bolognese citizens. So they owed their allegiance first and foremost to the commune, and secondly to the university. The commune was also acting, however, as we've seen, also against the imperial will to extend its own jurisdiction on all the students, which seems legit, at least in a territorial sense, being that if you enter there, if you come here, you're under my laws and you obey them, and you stay, under while you're here. So to the contrasts between masters and students, the ones between the latter and the commune increased towards, especially the beginning of the 13th, said the end of the 12th, beginning of the 13th century. This caused on the longer run, some groups of students to abandon the city, transferring themselves in other communes, right? And they began to convince, to solicit at least, some of their masters to follow them. This aspect is also fascinating, and in fact, at the end of the 12th century, some Bolognese students moved to the neighboring Modena, and with them, for example, transferred himself the famous Pius de Medicina, that was a famous lawyer of the time, famous master. At the beginning of the 13th century, further secessions of students gave life to studia in Vicenza, in the northeast of the Po Valley, in Arezzo, in Tuscany. These centers would have kind of backs and forths because, again, it was not kind of warranted that they would have had a future as universities, right? But say very important centers such as, for example, the one of Padua, who would become one of the single most important universities in Europe in 1222, was quite meaningful. As much as the further secession that occurred from the same Padua, for example, 6 years later only, where a group of students migrated to Vercelli from the opposite end of the Po Valley, from the east to the west, thus inaugurating in the Piedmontese commune a further studium, right? And in these cities, with the exception of Padua, the character which is very close to the one of Bologna, because it began to structure itself in similar ways, the communal authority, however, was much more present in the organization of the students, right? These were smaller centers, but they also had smaller amount of students in relative terms, probably because centers like Bologna and Padua were just more prestigious, right? So you wanted to obtain, you wanted to be schooled there, you wanted to be educated there. Thus, the communes had it easier to control the students, and they helped them somehow in this sense by unburdening them in exchange of this of the collecta they had to pay to their masters, right? And the commune actually took on these costs meaningfully, because evidently they cared about stabilizing the dependency of the students on both the local studium but also on the communal government. So something that would just be a sort of mean of centralization, right? Having students that were incentivized to move there, but remaining in exchange in a university that was well under the commune. However, in the larger centers, the problems remain, because in Bologna, for example, the contrasts between the students and the communal government required even the papal intervention. Right? In particular, Honorius III intervened in 1217 on the communal authorities by pressuring them, bringing them to abrogate the repressive measures that they had taken on towards the students. And 2 years later, with the papal bull of June the 28th, 1219, Honorius entrusted the scholars to the jurisdiction of the Bolognese archdeacon, establishing that the classes, the courses, would conclude with an examination carried out under the authority of this archdeacon. So, essentially, a prelate operating on behalf of the Pope, practically, as a sort of lord, right? So acting not very differently from how the emperor had behaved in the previous century. And he also disposed that in order to teach in Bologna, the masters had to obtain a licentia docendi from the same archdeacon, which was even heavier. So it literally meant that if the papal representative for the University of Bologna didn't give a specific permission, masters could not, the single master could not teach there, right? And this was definitely a way to intervene heavily also in the local policy, right? And further, it contained the commune, it contained the same masters, right? And it brought this new balance. Naturally, we should explain at some point also what was going on, right? Likely we'll make some video about medieval Bologna for the regional series, it's a historical regional series that explains you why, in the meanwhile, the weight of the papacy had increased. You can even just understand it from the date. Well, at the beginning of the 13th century, the papacy had reached the peak of its historical power. So that basically almost every Western polity was its own vassal, and especially in Bologna, that was part of the papal states. At least is how the Pope saw it. This power was extended in a more direct way. Naturally, all this happened in parallel with a very close attention from the side of the papacy and to Roman law, right? As equally, there was a great interest of the laymen towards the papal decretals, canon law. So all these institutions went in parallel, right? So the papal involvement in the Bolognese university affairs was still a way to also, right, connect with some figures, as we've seen even with conditioning the masters. And we will at some point look at these things also more in depth, but you understand how the game worked now. So the separation between masters and students adopted in Bologna in the other studia derived from her had as a consequence that the term universitas began to identify exclusively the students. In other words, this group was known as the Universitas Scholarium, so to specify the fact that it was the university of the students, right? Differently from what happened, for example, around the same years in Paris, where in the great theological study of Europe, the students were together with the teachers, right? And so the Universitas was a Universitas Scholarum. This so meaning that literally the scholars were all one with a student, like as a group, right? Naturally, Paris worked in a very different way because it was a much more regulated institution by the monarchy. It also taught something different. You couldn't spend theology, if not in an ecclesiastical career, right? Being a lawyer really meant something else. So Bologna and Paris were the most important universities in Europe, and the first one was about theology, the other about law. Not only, by the way, because also medicine was taught at the point, etc. But fundamentally, all right. And so they represent something else. From one side, the feudal monarchy; from the other side, the communal city, all right. In any case, there were important development naturally of the university during the 13th century, which is the apex of the great medieval civilization. And this is clear from the communal statutes, right? that talk about the university, and the same university statutes, right? Because they all regulated themselves autonomously by kind of influencing each other. Every university had its own statutes, but there was consequently an authority recognized, for example, in the commune, in the universal powers, and so on. So this played it again. It would be interesting to digress on it, but it's really complicated. So we'll see it in some parts, kind of specialized videos, put in this way. What were, however, the major changes during the 13th century? Well, first of all, in the lesser centers, in minor centers, the communal burden in the retribution of the teachers was confirmed, right? Thus, you have a greater reliance on of the students on the commune that has seen the sort of secessions for which students in part lost power as well altogether, because they could have been united, but they decided to split. So this brought to also a strengthening of the communal, say, in parallel to this, there had been a strengthening of the communal institutions that now were looking towards an ever more stattal direction, their cities, and by essentially winning over further the students, they could also make greater leverage on the masters that were thus also in practice depending on the same money that the commune would pay the students for attending the lessons. Right, so the commune really had a greater average now on the masters that were becoming also ever more important figures, connected, of course, with the commune, because normally who was in charge in the commune came also normally from the social background that would provide with the scholars there. So the interesting aspect of this is that everything is compacting, right? It's faring towards an ever more unitary dimension, right? There are still a lot of kind of divides and clashes and so on, but there is essentially also this is the case because what it's a stake in the commune is ever more kind of a central power, some sort that previously instead did not quite exist. Also, the commune had been born so spontaneously, with guilds, with clans, with essentially a private power. Right now, the commune was creating a public authority that entailed, by a degree now, also public education. So that's the system. In Padua, after the mid-13th century, you see the commune taking on, sometimes at least, the initiative of calling a master, and with him stipulating a contract in which they were committed to, essentially, to paying him a stipendium, right? So you see here even more specifically that some universities begin to pay the same masters themselves directly, which would be kind of part of a natural consequence of this relation, and calling specific masters, right? So creating even there kind of a high profile level of, say, institutional level of scholarly experience. This is, say, the same. We made lots of videos about the Italian communes, and you've seen this is the same period in which the podestas are called from abroad in the same way, right? So you have properly also among the scholars these kind of names that start appearing within the system from other cities, and the communes also compete for having these masters in their own university. And naturally, again, there was a lot of political ideologism behind this. There was a specific necessity also to orient the studies toward a certain direction, or to have just experts who were specifically to deal with also with administrative issues. within the commune, right? Because these lawyers were also asked opinions. They were to work with the podestats, with the communal council, etc. So they weren't just teachers; they were properly doctors of law, right? And this aspect tells you also how powerful, right, and how which kind of projection the figure of the lawyer had through the university in just a bit more than a century, let's say, or something more than a century and a half, not even. And this coexistence was experimented, in fact, also in Bologna, where it continued into the monopoly of the private collecta until the last decades of the 13th century, when the universitates solicited the city government to call new teachers. And these were, in fact, also hired with a contract paid by the commune. Right, so this sees the consolidation properly of an institutional model of the university. And between the end of the 13th and beginning of the 14th century, in Bologna, the universitates of the foreign students began to involve also local students and masters by obtaining by them a solemn obedience to the rectores, right? Meaning that the same students' organization had become now institutionalized at the same time. So that these were students, yes, but as we've seen, they were fundamentally paid. They depended now on the commune for having their studies maintained, and they began to have, of course, their own say. There were some autonomies that historically would maintain, but still, like as a broader institution that surpassed the original division between foreigners and locals, right, and began to become the kind of proper system, working all together again with the commune, with the masters, and so on. But the masters, in this sense, had also to respect the students' communities, as we've seen. They were the ones now that were fundamentally not to be followed, had to follow the universities as such, right? As groups of students, depending on the commune themselves, etc. During the 13th century, there was naturally also the definition of the university programs, the articulation of the courses, of the classes. So in a first moment, you would find mostly as the principal texts studied in this context the Digestum Vetus and the Codex, right? These texts were indicated as ordinary, right? So these were basically the standard ones that you would be told. Naturally, the programs could vary, but this was the base of them, right? As a consequence, also the classes, the lecture, were defined ordinarie, right? Because they were carried out on these texts, and they were kept in the morning. By the way, demane, because they were essentially the most important. That's the point where you had to go there fresher, right? Because it was very difficult to study this stuff. We don't concentrate on this during this video, but the the meaningful side of the story here is that you had basically to learn all the stuff by heart, right, in order to pass the exams, and literally by heart, which was admittedly easier to do at the time than today, because people were just more habituated to do so. But in general, like it was an enormous amount of information, and you had literally to know that by heart. Okay, there were people who knew the Bible by heart in this very time, in these very cities, but the working with that, with passing especially this exam, in the sense that you had to literally know everything to the perfection. Just think about this in relation set to the habitual standards of today's universities. I mean, it's ridiculous to say the least in comparison, and that's also why this institution was prestigious, because again, people who passed these exams were pretty damn good. They made a lot of money after that, and so there was a huge competition, and everybody was aware of that, right? It's not like today, which mostly you go to university just because you're lazy. Not that you shouldn't go there, of course, but you should go there with a greater motivation, a greater purpose in the first place. Then the lessons that, say, next to the digestum vetus and the colics, these were the parts of the corpus juris civilis, plus, as we'll see now, the texts that were used to comment them, right? And in fact, the Inforciatum and the Digestum Novum were the so-called extraordinary texts. So some additions to the principal texts and the lessons that were held on them were known as extraordinariae and taught de sero, so in the evening. They were secondary. Right, you had to learn it anyway, but they were, generally speaking, considered less important. If you look at the Bolognese University Statute of 1252, that is at least among the oldest, from one we can study properly more consistently. This established that every day 8 lessons were to be held, right? Each one lasted 2 hours, so basically you had 16 hours of lesson throughout the whole day. That, of course, you couldn't just attend entirely. This was also the point, right? The lessons were there, right? And they weren't quite standardized either, so what was taught there eventually had also in part to be, every teacher had its own things, and there was a general understanding of the, say that you could learn also on your own, just like today, but by law, by statute, there had to be these lessons. This had to be held. Right, and if you didn't, of course, this was a problem, because for masters, they were paid, as we've seen. So you were really just they were aware that you had to hold them in the first place. The masters would organize themselves accordingly. The students would more or less free, as we'll see now, to participate. These lessons had to be basically, as we've seen, of 2 hours each, and 2 for each of the ordinary books and the extraordinary ones, right? Eventually, it was the same students that solicited an enrichment of the courses with the extension of the lessons of the programs on the other libri legales, right? So such solicitations were basically accepted at the beginning of the 14th century. So you understand how gradual it was, right? There wasn't like a beginning which said, okay, we study the entirety of Roman law. Now, people wanted to learn specific things because they were either more difficult, more important at the same time, and that was it, right? Then you could simply study other the rest of Roman law for what it was being rediscovered, commented in the meanwhile, etc. But you fundamentally wanted those first ones first, right? And so, if you look at the Bolognese statutes of the 1317, you find that by this point, the commune took care of the salary of two cathedrals to destinate specifically to the digestum inforciatum, to the novum, and to the volumen. Right, this was done, by the way, and we've seen it in our videos, again, not just studying that text, but studying the text of the commentarists on it. Right, so this meant, as we have explained elsewhere, that you studied not just the texts, but all the doctrinal body that stemmed from the collection of comments that had historically been formed to study the same texts, the same books, so that were even more complicated by a degree. At least they had a method, a procedure. We have seen this, the methods of the commentarists. I think it's the title of the video, but there is more to it that we can talk at a point about. So as far as the 12th century is concerned, in the first days, let's say, we don't know exactly how the courses terminated. We know that their duration was fundamentally varying, was somehow arbitrary. In the 13th century, instead, the frequency became mandatory. Right? It was defined that the courses at the University of Bologna had to last 7 years, which would be brought to 8 in the 15th, right? So just think about that. In Padua it was 6, yes, but Bologna was more important, and that's also again why all the great jurists came from there, because it was like a terrifying, as you understand, costly experience. Not everybody had, even among some affluent people, probably the resources to have even one kid being taught for 8 years there, right? Especially a place, again, that had enriched itself through the university and beyond, so the life cost an important amount. So it was extremely prestigious in many ways, but that's also because they mastered their own, backside, let's say, because they literally had to learn this entire program by heart in practice. It's only between the 14th and 15th century that the conclusion of the studies was factually regulated, right? In the year before the last, the student that at this point had already the title of baccalaureus had to actually hold himself lessons on one title of one of the libri legales, right, of his choice. In the last year of studying, because he kept studying in the meanwhile, he had to hold public lecture on an entire book and to discuss a repetitio and a quaestio. All the stuff, again, it's in the video about the methods of the commentarists. And in the end, he would pick a master with whom he would have a private conversation, and if he basically obtained a positive judgment, he would become baccalaureus ad privatam admissus, because basically he could now present himself to the privatum examen, or privata or examen as it was called. That is to say, in front of a commission presided over by the archdeacon. Remember, we're talking about after the 13th century and the papal intervention on the university system there. And if the judgment of this commission was positive, the student would obtain the licentia, and thus he acquired the title of licenciatus in jure, right? Now, this was the end of the courses. It's as if today, like, you go to university, you do your master's, and you are there, right? If you wanted to get a doctorate, you had instead to pass an exam known as publica or conventus. That, by the way, was a big deal because it was carried out the formal ceremony in the Cathedral of Bologna. So, also with an important degree of solemnity, in front of God, etc. And the exam. This was an exam fundamentally that in the course of which the candidate, after having sworn, by the way, fealty to university, would would discuss in public, in fact, the themes that he had already discussed in the private examination. And if he so in front of everyone, so you couldn't quite even just get over that easily. And if you did something wrong, but you didn't know something, or somebody probably had a different opinion from yours, because this is also what could happen among the jurists. And if he passed this proof, he would have received from the archdeacon, or at least on a representative of his, the title of doctor in jure civili, together with the symbols of science. There is all an ether here that we can also look at a bit more in depth, maybe in another video, but this was practically the procedure. So the system within which masters and students operated was known in the Middle Ages, as you've heard me calling it, studium, right? In fact, the Universitas Scholarium that we have seen before, that managed to become important as surpassing even the masters, etc., in fact, was just about the aggregation of the sole students, right? The studium was the comprehensive system, right? And as a term, it appears for the first time in Bologna in 1217, from which it spread to the other centers, right? So that's why we call it today alma mater studiorum, all this stuff, right? And in the sources of the time, the term studium is followed by the adjective generale, general, when it concerned those centers that had received the licentia ubique docendi, that is to say, the right to teach all over the world, right? Remember this, because as far as universal education literally meant as the education of universal power and authorities, right? These doctors at a point had to, as we've seen, respond to the emperors, to the popes, right? So all of Western Christendom was already at the time structuring itself according to the sense that we had a common standard of education. And unironically enough, this is what extended to the rest of the world nowadays, right? So that the term doctor is out there, of course, and it's a standard title recognized worldwide as the highest academic one, because we have some specific standards, right? That I think even as a doctor that our titles are not so high. to highly regard nowadays, of course, but it is true that they're still the best that we have in relative terms. So you have to reflect also again on the recovery of civilization, not saying, it's bad because the institution is bad. The institution is not bad, it's the people, right? Which is a completely different thing. Institution is civilization. Institution is even more important than the people, obviously enough, right? Which is a concept we should recover from tradition. But this is exactly the point of it all, that there was this license, the licencia, that could be conferred only by a universal authority. I mean, you understand here the perfect logic of universal tradition, of imperial tradition. In this case, only the Pope or the Emperor had the faculty of electing a doctor that could be recognized as such everywhere in the Western Christendom, thus in the world. Right? So during the 14th century, this privilege was obtained by Bologna, Padua, and other studia such as Perugia, Pisa, Pavia, and Siena. So if you pass there, well, the idea was that these centers were so important. Naturally, these are, meaningful universities in Italy in this case, but that they have some of the highest standards in the world still today, in fact, that had the specific effect, quality to confer this licenza ubiqua docendi that made these doctors the most sought after, right, in the world at the time. So I don't know how interested you are in these topics, because I know that some of you just follow me because it's the daily thing and you get habituated to the stuff I give you. But I realize that you do follow them every time there is a university video. I said, oh my god, to myself, it's boring. It's not boring, obviously, because when you explain that, or when you learn of that, especially if you've never heard it, because more or less I had to study this stuff already at some point, being examined on it. But the meaning, at least, of this word, I think emerges a bit better, right? It makes you understand. It makes you reacquire confidence on the meaning of education, of institutions, and how they thus, how they were born, and with which spirit, with which principles, and with which logic they were born. There is so much here intertwining between the practical interests, but that still were accompanied, because otherwise the university would have not been born, by theoretical questions, moral questions, political questions, right? Where the studia found that there was it was a pretty strong political reason, as we've seen why. And what is meaningful of that is that these universities were as spontaneous as they were born, recognized as fundamentally provided with an inherent liberty, right? Which was at some point, of course, mitigated, but of course, like any other liberty, because otherwise it wouldn't be liberty. It would be just freedom, and there wouldn't be any value in it unless they had managed to conquer the world, which they did at that point. Not even the empire could. So they were, let's say, in a sense, they maintained that university spirit still exists today, or at least today it doesn't exist anymore. But that was supposed to be a place that you can challenge, but you cannot practically eliminate, because aside from the various political tensions, all the various authorities involved here knew that these centers were the best educational ones. And so they estimated them, they admired them, they looked after the same guys that had been educated there for their administration, for their policies and so on. So the government, and all falls, as we've seen, logically into place, right? So you have, from one side, imagine just the pride of knowing science at the time, being able to exercise it. There was a quite strong, as we've seen, also public involvement in the certification of your competence, and a sense that this university activity was still responding to a higher order things that was naturally divine, and that brought to the consistent awareness that the world was to be based on science, was to be organized, governed, and felt properly, and lived and fought for through standards that were high, had to be high, had to be very harsh, as we've seen. Just courses that lasted 8 years on a regular basis. So beyond what most people are even willing to do nowadays, because they were serious things, much more serious things than today's, and with completely different standards accordingly. We could naturally talk more about this, and we will surely talk about a university again, and we will observe other aspects also on how the masters taught, or how the students lived. And there is really, again, a lot around this world that is a bit the same world you've seen today. You see today, as far as this teaching experience is concerned, learning experience is concerned. But people also turn ways, right? They study there, but there is a future. There is a work. There is a career there, and that is also very important to understand who ruled, who administered the Middle Ages, and they passed through these places. So it's really crucial to understand. In any case, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time.